I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me.
It was a clock starting. Because here is what Camilla may not have fully calculated in her decades of careful positioning. The institution she married into was not static. It was not frozen in the moment of the coronation, locked permanently in the image of her sitting beside Charles with that tiara on her head. It was alive. It was changing. And the people now controlling the direction of that change were not the ones who had spent 20 years slowly accepting her presence. Nobody announced it. Nobody wrote about it. Nobody inside Buckingham Palace issued a statement, scheduled a press briefing, or picked up the phone to call a single journalist. There was no leaked memo. No coordinated spin. No carefully worded denial from a communications team that usually has an answer for everything. There was just a phone call. One phone call. Placed on a quiet morning in early 2026, from a senior palace aide to a number that almost nobody in the royal inner circle would have recognized. The call lasted less than 10 minutes. Short. Precise. And according to sources close to the situation, it was not the kind of call you make when you are still deciding what to do. It was the kind of call you make after the decision is already final, and all you need is confirmation that the road ahead is legally clear. The aide was calling on behalf of Princess Anne. The subject was Camilla. Let that settle for a moment. Princess Anne. 75 years old. The Princess Royal. A woman who has spent more than 7 decades inside this institution watching, absorbing, managing, and saying absolutely nothing she did not intend to say. A woman whose discipline is so complete that even people who have worked alongside her for decades describe her as unknowable in the way that only the truly self-possessed can be. She watched the affairs unfold in real time. She watched the separation, the televised confessions, the panorama interview, the divorce. She watched Diana walk into that Paris tunnel and not come back. She carried all of it, privately and professionally, the way she carries everything, without flinching, without breaking, without ever once letting the institution see the cost.
Yeah, I think stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit. But in terms of, you know, doing the job and things like that, I don't feel too overwhelmed by that. Not now, anyway.
And then, in early 2026, she made a move. Not a speech. Not a confrontation. A phone call to a lawyer. Think about what that means. Because in the world and in habits, a phone call to a lawyer is not a casual act. It is a declaration. It is the moment a private conviction becomes a structured intention. And the fact that it was placed quietly, without fanfare, without witnesses beyond the aide who made it, that is not an accident. That is Anne operating exactly as Anne operates. With precision. With patience. With the kind of long-game thinking that only becomes visible once the pieces are already in motion. Hi viewers, I want to ask you something personal before we go any further. Did you believe Camilla would ever truly face consequences for what happened to Diana, yes or no? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now here is what makes this moment genuinely extraordinary. Because to understand why a phone call placed by Princess Anne in early 2026 matters, you have to understand what Camilla's world looked like before that call was made. By the beginning of 2026, Camilla Parker Bowles had completed one of the most remarkable image transformations in the modern history of the British monarchy. She had gone from the most publicly despised woman in Britain. The other woman, the Shadow, the name that Diana supporters treated as a kind of villain in a story that cost a beloved princess everything, to Queen Consort. She sat beside King Charles at every state occasion. She appeared on official photographs. She wore the tiaras. She gave the speeches. She attended the charitable engagements and smiled for the cameras and let the world watch the rehabilitation in real time until enough people accepted it that it simply became reality. On the 6th of May, 2023, Camilla walked into Westminster Abbey at the coronation wearing the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. Queen Elizabeth's personal favourite. The piece that appeared on British banknotes for decades. A tiara so loaded with symbolic weight that the choice to place it on Camilla's head was not a fashion decision. It was a statement. It was the institution declaring, formally and finally, that the transformation was complete. That the woman who spent 30 years as the other woman had arrived. That the rehabilitation was not just tolerated, it was official. For her supporters, that moment was triumph. For millions of others, it reopened something that had never fully closed. And for certain people inside that palace, people who had watched every chapter of the story unfold, people who carried their own version of the grief that chapter produced, sources suggest it was something else entirely. They were the ones who had spent 20 years watching their mother suffer. And one of them, as of early 2026, controlled £1.2 billion in land, property, and investments, with no consultation required from anyone, including the king. The other had access to a room inside Windsor Castle that Camilla had very good reasons to hope would stay locked. That phone call was 10 minutes long. The aide said very little. The lawyer said less. But before the call ended, according to sources, one thing was made clear. They just needed to know the path was clear. It was. And what came next would quietly, permanently, and methodically begin to dismantle everything Camilla Parker Bowles had spent 30 years building, not in one confrontation, not in one dramatic public moment, but in the way that only the truly patient and the truly motivated can dismantle something.
Okay, we have to shift the way we support, and that's what we need to do.
And what does that shift look like for you?
Well, that's we don't know yet. I mean, there was an order to the years because my mother didn't change very much. We kind of knew what the rhythm of the year was, so things like that will change, and how we are part of the support for the monarchy may change slightly. Who knows?
Piece by piece, decision by decision, in complete silence. The machine was already moving. Camilla just didn't know it yet. William Arthur Philip Louis did not grieve loudly. He never has. That has always been the thing about him that the public misreads as coldness, as distance, as the kind of emotional unavailability you might expect from a man raised inside a family that institutionalized restraint into something close to religion. But those who know him really know him, not the version that appears at ribbon cuttings and state dinners. Will tell you something different. They will tell you that William does not grieve loudly because he does not grieve and then move on. He grieves and he remembers. He grieves and he catalogues. He grieves and he waits. He has been waiting for a very long time. September 2022. Queen Elizabeth II is gone. The mourning period is still raw, the flowers outside the palace still fresh, the world still processing the end of a 70-year reign. And in the middle of all of that, something happened that had nothing to do with ceremony or flowers or the quiet transition of a crown. Something happened that was entirely legal, entirely procedural, and entirely consequential. William became the Duke of Cornwall. And with that title came control of the Duchy of Cornwall. £1.2 billion in land, property, and investments accumulated across nearly 700 years of royal estate management. Tenant farms stretching across the south of England. Holiday cottages. The Isles of Scilly. Dartmoor land rights. Commercial investments of a kind and scale that most people never associate with the monarchy because the monarchy has always kept them quiet. £30 million generated in a single year, 2025 alone. All of it now under the sole authority of a 43-year-old man who had just spent 25 years watching his father's second wife accumulate influence, access, and legitimacy inside the institution that William was now positioned to shape. No consultation required. No approval needed from Charles. No committee, no vote, no oversight body with the power to override him. Just William. And £1.2 billion. And a very long memory. The first move came quietly. That is the word sources keep using when they describe what William has done since September 2022. Quietly. Because nothing he has done exists in isolation as a headline. Nothing generates outrage on its own. Everything makes complete administrative sense when examined individually. And everything, when you step back and look at the full picture, adds up to something that cannot be accidental. Annabel Elliot. That name is the beginning of understanding what William has built. Annabel Elliot is Camilla's younger sister. Interior designer. A woman who, for nearly 20 years, worked across Duchy of Cornwall properties under King Charles, sourcing materials, overseeing renovations, consulting on the aesthetic direction of royal spaces that required a particular kind of taste and a particular kind of discretion.
We are so close to this moment. Here we are again with history, with coronation. Forgive me if this is a naive question, but how on earth do you prepare for that?
Good question. We've been very lucky. My mother was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for.
She was paid between £19,000 and £82,000 per project depending on scope. Her name appeared in financial records consistently, reliably, year after year. The moment William assumed control of the duchy, Annabel's name stopped appearing. No announcement. No statement. No public dispute, no press release, no carefully managed transition to a replacement. Just gone. And William brought in his own people. Friends from his personal circle. Godparents of his children. People loyal specifically and exclusively to him. Royal commentators noticed immediately. Sources say the move sent ripples through the palace that lasted for weeks. Because everyone who understood how these things work understood what it meant. It was not a financial decision. It was not an aesthetic one. It was a message. Delivered without a single word being spoken publicly, in the language that royal institutions have always used when they want to communicate something without the embarrassment of having to say it out loud. The message was received. But Annabel Elliot was only the first move. What followed went considerably further. Access to Crown events that had previously been extended to members of Camilla's wider family circle, quietly withdrawn. Invitations to official royal occasions where Parker Bowles family members had reasonably expected to be present, restructured without explanation. Appearances that Camilla's network had taken for granted, the kind of proximity to institutional power that 2 decades of careful positioning had built, narrowed. One by one. Gradually. In a pattern so deliberate that each individual decision could be dismissed as administrative housekeeping while the cumulative effect was anything but. Tom Parker Bowles. Camilla's son. His access to Balmoral and certain royal spaces allegedly gone. Following an undisclosed incident, sources say. No details made public. Just a door that used to open now remaining closed. And then there is the Sarah Ferguson dimension, which sits in a category of its own. Sarah Ferguson, Fergie, the former Duchess of York, the woman the royal family has kept at arm's length for 30 years while Camilla somehow maneuvered closer to the center, is now a liability that Camilla cannot manage her way out of. Ferguson's name appears in files released by the United States Department of Justice in connection with Jeffrey Epstein. There is no evidence of criminal conduct on her part. The association, however, is documented. It exists. And in the context of the ongoing institutional fallout surrounding Prince Andrew's situation, sources say William's position has been communicated to Camilla without ambiguity. Distance yourself from Ferguson. Publicly. Permanently. Camilla has not fully complied. She views the friendship as predating her entire royal life. She views the demand to end it as both personally impossible and fundamentally unfair. William views her continued loyalty to Ferguson as a demonstration of exactly the kind of judgment that justifies his concerns about her fitness to represent the institution going forward. That standoff is unresolved. And with every week it continues, sources say, it costs Camilla something she cannot easily replace. Influence. Now stop. Because there is something else William has been doing with the duchy that nobody in Camilla's circle fully appreciated until recently. Something that makes everything else look like preparation. He has been pointing money at Diana. Specifically, he has been redirecting duchy-connected philanthropic resources toward causes Diana originally championed. Mental health, homelessness, HIV awareness. The causes that the royal establishment of the 1980s and 1990s actively resisted Diana championing because they were considered too raw, too political, too emotionally direct for a senior royal to engage with publicly. Diana championed them anyway. She touched patients that others refused to be photographed near. She sat on floors with people the institution considered beneath the dignity of a princess's attention. She was right about all of it. And the institution punished her for being right. Now her son controls £1.2 billion in assets and £30 million in annual income. And sources say he is pointing a deliberate portion of it toward exactly the places his mother pointed when she was being told to stop. That is not philanthropy. That is a statement. And it is a statement that Camilla has no counter to, because you cannot publicly object to mental health funding without destroying yourself, and you cannot privately object without confirming everything William's supporters already believe about where her loyalties actually sit. The machine was moving on two fronts simultaneously. And the second front was the one that certain people inside Buckingham Palace were only beginning to understand. Because while William was using money to reshape the future, Princess Anne had turned her attention to something older. Something locked behind a door that most people in Britain do not even know exists. There is a room at Windsor Castle. No visitor access. No documentary cruise. No freedom of information request that has ever returned a meaningful result. It does not appear on tour maps. It is not mentioned in official palace literature. It sits inside Windsor Castle as one of those spaces that simply exists for the people who need it to exist and remains invisible to everyone else. It is called the Royal Archives. What it contains is the unedited, privately recorded history of the British royal family. Letters written in the heat of private moments. Diary entries that were never intended for any reader other than the person who wrote them.
And for their contribution in terms of broadening what we hope was a general interest to you, but also your response to that, which is equally important. And those sort of observations are critical to me. I mean, I'm grateful because you've come together as a group. Interestingly, if you like, I'm not here because this was my choice. You very kindly asked me to become patron of your organisation.
Internal palace correspondence from decades past, the kind of written record that institutions generate when they are managing a crisis and need a paper trail that exists only for themselves. The contemporaneous documentation of everything that happened inside this family during the most turbulent period of the 20th century. Including the years when the marriage of Charles and Diana was falling apart in front of the entire world. Princess Anne's access to those materials sits at a level very few people outside the immediate family possess. She has not been denied entry. She has always had the access. What sources suggest, and this is the part that is making certain people inside Buckingham Palace genuinely uneasy, is that she has recently been using it. The public record of what happened to the Wales marriage is already extensive. The 1992 separation. The Camillagate tapes in 1993. Charles' televised confession in 1994. Diana's Panorama interview in 1995. The divorce in 1996. The Paris Tunnel in 1997. 30 years of books, documentaries, retrospectives, and analyses have processed that sequence of events from every conceivable angle. There is very little about the broad strokes that most informed observers do not already know. But broad strokes are not what the Royal Archives contain. What sources suggest those materials document is the specificity. Who knew what, and precisely when they knew it? Who facilitated what, and through which institutional channels? how Diana's concerns were received and managed internally, not how the palace presented that management to the press afterward, but how it actually unfolded in real time, documented in writing by the people doing the managing. The institutional dimension of a private human collapse. The paper trail of a system responding to a member of its own family who was suffering visibly and publicly, and the decisions that were made about how to handle that suffering. Sources familiar with Anne's alleged archival review say the materials tell a story about institutional failure that goes considerably further than anything the public record has ever fully captured. Anne's position, according to sources, is not complicated. The historical record of that period should be complete. It should be unredacted. And the woman now sitting beside the king at every state occasion, the woman whose presence in that marriage was central to its collapse, has no right to shape how the most painful chapter of Diana's life gets remembered by history. That is where Anne keeps landing. And sources say that conclusion has implications for Camilla that extend far beyond anything happening with property or payroll. Then came the phone call that Charles made to Anne. February 2026. 40 minutes long. Sources describe it as one of the most painful sibling conversations in decades. Not angry. Not accusatory. Quiet. The measured, careful tone of a man who has thought very hard about what he is going to say and arrived at the phone call already knowing that none of it is going to be enough. Charles is 76 years old. He was diagnosed with cancer in February 2024, the specific type never publicly disclosed, with treatment continuing through 2024 and into 2025. He has maintained his public schedule with genuine discipline across that period. But discipline is not the same as capacity. And the particular kind of sustained, conflict-absorbing engagement that protecting Camilla would require right now is precisely what his current situation makes most difficult. He knows what Anne is doing. He knows why she is doing it. He called her anyway. He spent 40 minutes on that call searching for an argument that would land. An argument she would actually hear. An argument that could redirect what she is building before it builds any further. The call ended with nothing resolved. Think about what that means coming from a king. He could have demanded she stop. He could have issued a directive through official palace channels, asserted his authority as the monarch, as the head of the family, as the man whose name is on the reign being documented in those archives. He could have done any of that. He did not. Because doing any of that would require him to argue against something he does not entirely disagree with. Protecting Camilla from what William and Anne are doing would mean telling William to restore access and privileges William deliberately and legally withdrew. William would not comply. Charles knows that. It would mean instructing Anne to step away from the archives and let the historical record remain as shaped as it currently is. Anne would not comply. Charles knows that too. And somewhere in those 40 minutes, according to sources, Charles could not locate a single argument he actually believed. Because the grief driving both of them, the grief that is the engine of this entire operation, is grief he created. He was the cause of it. He conducted the relationship that Diana described in terms of profound. And whatever authority a king carries into a conversation, it does not include the authority to tell his son that his mother's suffering doesn't warrant what the son has decided to do about it. Sources say Charles made one comment to a senior aide during this period that those close to him describe as quietly revealing. He did not express anger at William. He did not express frustration with Anne. He expressed understanding. The understanding of a man who knows that the people moving against his wife are doing so for reasons he himself created, and who has found no answer for that, not in 40 minutes on the phone with his sister, not in any conversation since. The machine kept moving. Now watch what happens to the symbols. Because this part of the story is subtle in the way that only the most consequential things tend to be subtle, easy to miss individually, impossible to misread collectively. When Camilla walked into Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May, 2023, wearing that tiara, it was the visible culmination of 20 years of work. Royal patronages accumulated carefully over time. Charitable associations built to give her position substance and legitimacy beyond simply being Charles's wife. ceremonial roles that placed her inside the institutional architecture of the crown as something permanent and irreplaceable. All of it built, piece by piece, across 2 decades of managed rehabilitation. Sources suggest that accumulation is now being interrupted. Specific high-profile patronages that were being positioned for Camilla quietly redirected. Not through any announced decision that could be pointed to and debated publicly. Through a reallocation that sources describe as reflecting priorities rather than logistics. The kind of adjustment that happens when the people making decisions have already agreed on the direction and simply implement it without requiring a meeting. In 2025, King Charles granted William and Catherine the authority to issue royal warrants. The ability to publicly endorse brands and institutions on behalf of the crown, a privilege monarchs have historically protected carefully, extending it rarely and with great deliberation. Extending it to William and Catherine was a public signal about where the crown's symbolic weight is being deliberately moved. Toward the next generation. Toward the future of the institution. Away from the current reign. Away from everything associated with it. Away from Camilla. Sources also suggest that decisions currently being made about how the reign of Charles III gets documented, official photographs, historical displays, the visual archive of this period, are being made in ways that reflect William and Anne's priorities about what should be remembered. Who gets centered in the frame? Whose presence in the visual record is prominent? Whose becomes background? Whose, over time, fades? Royal history is shaped by what gets preserved and how. The visual record of a reign becomes the historical record. The historical record becomes legacy. And Camilla's legacy, sources suggest, is being shaped right now by 2 people with very specific and very personal views about what it should contain. Ray Millhouse. That is the detail that tells you how much Camilla already understands of what is happening. Ray Millhouse was Camilla's personal retreat in Wiltshire. A property she owned before she married Charles, before the coronation, before any of the institutional scaffolding of her current life existed. She publicly described it as her escape. The garden there, she once said, was the best therapy in the world. It was the one place that existed before the Queen Consort title, before the rehabilitation arc, before any of the official machinery of royal life surrounded her. It was hers. She sold it. Quietly. No press release. No lifestyle magazine feature with photographs of the garden she loved. No carefully managed farewell. It appeared on the market and it disappeared from her portfolio and nobody explained why. People do not sell their personal sanctuaries without reason. They do not part with the one place that belongs entirely to them, that predates everything that came after, unless something has shifted fundamentally in how they see what comes next. And what comes next for Camilla, when Charles is gone, is something her current daily life makes easy to not think about. When Charles dies, Sandringham passes to William. Balmoral passes to William. Buckingham Palace becomes William and Catherine's primary official residence. The properties Camilla currently moves through as of right, as Queen Consort, as the King's wife, as the woman the institution officially recognizes, become properties she can only enter at William's invitation. Every space that currently belongs to her by virtue of her title reverts to the man who has spent 28 years watching what that title was built on. Her likely inheritance, Clarence House, valued at approximately £72 million, and Highgrove, valued at around £39 million. Significant by any ordinary standard. Completely inadequate as a substitute for the position she currently holds. She would go from Queen Consort with the full institutional weight of the British monarchy behind her, to a private citizen with a courtesy title, living in 2 houses, at the discretion of a man she has no leverage over and never will. Sources say Camilla understands that arithmetic completely. She has understood it for some time. The question she perhaps did not fully answer in advance was whether the people around her had the patience and the precision to actually execute what they were capable of executing. She has her answer now. And here is where everything in this story arrives at its true destination. Because there is a version of what William and Anne are doing that looks like personal payback. a coordinated effort to dismantle everything Camilla built as a direct response to what she did to Diana. Revenge, dressed up in administrative language and institutional process. That version is too simple. And sources suggest it is not the accurate one. Simple revenge would look different. It would be public. It would be dramatic. It would involve a confrontation, a statement, a moment where Camilla is visibly and humiliatingly stripped of something in front of the cameras she has spent 20 years learning to manage. That would be revenge. What William and Anne are allegedly building is something quieter. Something that outlasts any single dramatic moment. Something that, once complete, cannot be undone by a change of heart or a reconciliation or a carefully worded statement from a palace communications team. Think about what Diana actually stood for. Not the image. The substance. She walked through active minefields to make a point about weapons. She sat with people that the establishment considered too marginal, too complicated, too politically inconvenient for a senior royal to be associated with. She treated people the institution had quietly decided didn't warrant that kind of attention as if they were completely and fully human. She was right. About all of it. The institution resisted her, managed her, and ultimately found her impossible to contain. Now her son runs the institution. And the emotional intelligence Diana was told was inappropriate, the public accountability she was told was dangerous, the genuine human connection she was told was beneath royal dignity. Sources suggest William is building all of it into the architecture of the monarchy he is constructing. Not as tribute. As design. As what the institution becomes under his direction, permanently and structurally, in a way that no successor can easily dismantle. And runs parallel to all of this. Decades of quiet, unglamorous, genuinely impactful work, the kind of royal service that accumulates meaning not through spectacle but through consistency. She has spent her entire adult life making a living argument against performative royalty, against the idea that the crown's value is primarily symbolic. She has been making that argument since before Diana ever joined this family. And when Diana arrived and began making the same argument in her own way, and watched, understood, and carried her own version of the grief when the institution chose to resist rather than listen. Sources describe what Anne and William are doing as a two-front operation. History and money. The past and the future. The royal archives and the Duchy of Cornwall. The written record of what this family did and the financial architecture of what it becomes. Both fronts being reshaped simultaneously by the two people in this family with the most personal reasons to do the reshaping. And Camilla is caught directly between them. She won the battle. Let that be acknowledged. She got Charles. She survived the Panorama interview and the public fury and the decades of being the most publicly scrutinized other woman in the world. She got the title and the coronation and the tiara and the seat beside the king at every state occasion. She built something, across 20 years, that looked like permanence. But the war was never about Charles. It was about Diana. About what Diana represented and whether the institution she tried to change would eventually become something worthy of the price she paid for trying. Camilla cannot argue against that. You cannot counter a legacy with a strategy. You cannot outmaneuver grief that has been building for 28 years in a man who controls everything she will eventually need. You cannot negotiate with an archive that simply contains what it contains, documented by people who were there and wrote it down at the time. Diana never saw any of this. She got a Paris tunnel and 2 boys without their mother and a royal family that waited longer than most of the world thought acceptable before it lowered its flag. She did not get to see what her son would become. She did not get to see what her sister-in-law would eventually decide to do. She did not get to see the monarchy she spent her life trying to change begin to actually change in the direction she pointed. August 31st, 2027, will mark 30 years since she died. And quietly, without a press release, without a summit, without a single public confrontation that anyone could point to as the moment it all changed, her son and her sister-in-law are building something inside that palace that she never lived to witness. Not with anger. Not with urgency. with the patience of people who know that what they are building will still be standing long after the noise has faded. Camilla did not lose to a rival. She lost to a memory. And a memory, unlike a person, cannot be managed, cannot be negotiated with, and cannot be made to go away. The machine is still moving. The archives are still being reviewed. The duchy is still being redirected. The symbols are still being quietly repositioned. And somewhere inside one of the properties she currently has access to as of right, properties that will revert to William's sole authority when the time comes, Camilla Parker Bowles is living inside a structure that is being methodically and permanently rearranged around her. One quiet decision at a time. Now, there is something else developing inside this story. Something that sources say has not yet fully surfaced publicly. Something involving a specific document inside those royal archives, a piece of private correspondence from the early 1990s, that sources suggest has the potential to reframe not just Camilla's position but the official historical account of this entire period in ways that certain people inside the palace are not prepared for. That document exists. Sources confirm it. And what it allegedly contains goes further than anything covered in this chapter. That is the next story. And if what sources are describing is accurate, you will not want to miss it.